My name is Marcus Bell. I'm 46, and I spent 11 years investigating insurance fraud for a living, which means I built a career out of one simple skill: noticing when something didn't add up. It's a strange thing to be good at that and still miss it in your own house. 5 years after my divorce, my ex-wife sent me a text that said, "I made a mistake." 3 words. No context. I sat with it for a full minute before I noticed the message had been sent to a group thread. I wasn't the only name on it. I want to tell you how I got there, because the text isn't where the story starts. It's where it ends. The story starts on a Tuesday in October, 11 years into my marriage to a woman named Renee, in a kitchen with a leaking faucet I kept meaning to fix and never did. We'd been married long enough that the house had settled around us the way a house does: creaks in places that used to be silent, habits worn into the floor like footpaths. I worked claims investigation for a regional insurer. Renee taught middle school art. We had 2 kids, Sophie and Daniel, 8 and 11 that year, and a life that looked, from any reasonable distance, like it was working. I noticed the faucet drip changed pitch around the same time I noticed Renee started taking her phone into the bathroom. I noticed both. I fixed the faucet. I didn't ask about the phone. That's the first thing you should understand about me. I fix things. I don't always name them. It took me a long time to understand that those aren't the same instinct, even though for years I told myself they were. Renee had started volunteering 2 evenings a week at a community arts program downtown, helping organize an exhibit for local students. It was the kind of thing she'd always wanted to do and never had time for, and I was glad for her. I drove the kids to practice on those nights. I made dinner. I told myself I was being a good partner by not asking too many questions about her schedule, because asking too many questions had always felt, to me, like a kind of control I didn't want to be. Looking back, that was the first sign. I just didn't have a name for it yet. The exhibit coordinator was a man named Paul Whitfield. I knew his name before I knew anything else about him, because Renee mentioned him the way you mention someone who matters more than you're letting on, too casually, too often, with a kind of careful neutrality that drew more attention to itself than silence would have. Paul thought the lighting should be warmer. Paul said the kids' work deserved a real opening night, not just a hallway display. I filed it away the way I filed away anomalies at work: not yet a case, just a pattern worth watching. I didn't watch it. That's the part one have to be honest about. I noticed the pattern and then I let it go, because watching it would have meant admitting I needed to. The volunteering went from 2 nights a week to 3. Then there was a Saturday workshop. Then a planning dinner with the committee that ran until 11. I drove the kids to a movie that night, ate popcorn I didn't want, and came home to an empty driveway I told myself not to think about. I called it trust then. I wouldn't call it that anymore. Sophie was the one who said it first, the way kids say things, sideways, without knowing what they're handing you. She was 8. We were in the car, and she asked why Mom always smelled like a candle now. I asked what kind of candle. She said she didn't know, just that it wasn't our candles. It wasn't the kind we had in the house. I didn't say anything. I just drove. But something in me filed it differently than the other anomalies, not as a pattern anymore. As a fact waiting for a frame. I started noticing the way Renee held her phone. Face down on the counter, screen toward the wood. She'd always left it face up before, careless, the way you do with someone you don't think is looking. Now it was deliberate. A small adjustment. The kind of thing that means nothing to anyone except someone trained to notice when behavior changes shape. I am a man who reads inconsistency for a living. I read claims that don't match the damage, statements that don't match the timeline, stories that are too smooth in the wrong places. I had spent over a decade getting paid to notice exactly what I was choosing not to notice at my own kitchen counter. I hadn't put it all together yet. But something in me already had. The exhibit opened in November. I went. I stood in a gymnasium that smelled like fresh paint and watched my wife laugh at something a man said with his hand resting, just slightly too long, on the small of her back. Paul Whitfield was younger than me by maybe 4 years, the kind of easy good looking that comes from never having had to work at being likable. He shook my hand. He told me how lucky I was. He meant it the way men mean things they've already decided don't count as guilt. I shook his hand back. I smiled. I didn't say anything. That was the moment. I didn't know it yet. But that was it. I want to be precise about what happened next, because precision is the only thing I trust myself to get right in hindsight. I didn't confront her. I didn't follow her. I did what I do at work, I started building a timeline. Her phone went into the bathroom at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and didn't come out until 10:15. 28 minutes. The following Tuesday, 31 minutes. I didn't read anything. I didn't need to read anything. I needed the pattern, because the pattern was the only thing that would let me be certain enough to act, and I was not going to accuse my wife of something I might be wrong about. I had seen what unfounded accusations did to families in my line of work. I was not going to be that. I was already sure. I told myself I wasn't, because being sure meant doing something, and I had spent my whole marriage believing that doing nothing was the same as keeping the peace. I had been measuring the distance between us in the wrong units. In December, Renee told me the exhibit committee was meeting on Christmas Eve to finalize plans for a spring show. Christmas Eve. We had a tradition, had had it since before the kids were born, of decorating the tree together on the 24th, just the 4 of us, hot chocolate, the same 5 Christmas albums we'd played every year. She told me she'd be back by 8. She came home at 11:15. The kids were asleep. I was sitting in the dark living room with a half-decorated tree and 4 ornament boxes still taped shut. She said it was work. She'd been saying that for 3 months. I looked at her and I thought about every claim I'd ever denied because the story had just slightly too many convenient gaps in it. I thought about how easy it would have been, at work, to flag this. And I thought about how much harder it is to flag your own life, because flagging it means admitting the version you've been living in might not be real. I didn't say any of that. I said the tree looked fine half done. We finished it together in silence, ornament by ornament, the smell of her perfume wrong in a way I'd noticed for weeks and never said out loud. Her perfume was wrong when she came home that night. Not different, wrong. I knew the brand she usually wore. This wasn't it. In January, I hired a private investigator. Not out of suspicion alone, by then I had something closer to certainty, and certainty, in my line of work, is a thing you verify before you act on it, never a thing you act on alone. His name was Glenn Tucker, a retired city detective who did this kind of work quietly, without theatrics. I gave him the Tuesdays. I gave him Paul Whitfield's name. I gave him 3 weeks. He came back with photographs I didn't need to study for long. A motel off the interstate, 20 minutes from the school. Her car parked behind the building, not in front. A pattern stretching back at least 4 months, possibly longer. Glenn was careful to say possibly longer, because the motel didn't keep records past 90 days and there was no way to know how far back it actually went. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my own office for 20 minutes before I went inside that day. I already knew what I'd find when I opened the file. I just hadn't let myself feel the shape of it yet. I want to tell you what I did with that information, because it says more about me than the affair itself does, and I've had 5 years to sit with that. I didn't confront her. Not that week. Not the next. I went back to work. I read fraud claims. I picked Sophie up from soccer and Daniel up from chess club. I made coffee every morning and set it on the counter next to her, the way I always had, and didn't say a single word that would have given away what I knew. I was building a case. That's the only honest way to describe it. Part of me, the part that had spent 11 years in a profession built on proof, wanted more than photographs. I wanted to understand the scope of it before I let it become a single conversation that would end everything in one night. I told myself I was protecting the kids by waiting. I think now I was protecting myself from the moment when waiting would no longer be an option. I had confused not fighting with not hurting. They are not the same thing. By February, Glenn had more. Text records weren't something he could legally access, but he didn't need them. Renee had started leaving her laptop open at home with an email account synced that she'd apparently forgotten still logged in automatically on our shared family computer, the one in the kitchen the kids used for homework. I found it by accident, looking for a school permission slip. 11 months of messages. Not 4. 11. The earliest one was dated the spring before the volunteering even started. Before Paul Whitfield had a name I recognized. That detail rearranged everything. I had built my entire understanding of the timeline around the exhibit, around Paul, around a story that had a clean beginning. The real beginning was earlier, smaller, and it had nothing to do with art classes or community committees. It started, as far as I could tell from what I read, with a conversation at her sister's 40th birthday party, a party I hadn't attended because I'd been at a work conference in Ohio. I'd been measuring the wrong event as the start of the fire. The fire had been burning for almost a year before I ever smelled smoke. I didn't read everything. I want to be honest about that too. I read enough to confirm what I needed to confirm, and then I stopped, because some lines, once crossed, can't be uncrossed, and I didn't want to carry more of her private words than I had to. I am not proud of having read any of it. I am only telling you that I did. I confronted her on a Sunday in late February. The kids were at her mother's for the afternoon. I laid the photographs on the kitchen table, the same table where I'd set her coffee down every morning for 11 years, and I didn't say anything. I let the photographs do it. She asked how I found out. Not whether it was true. How I found out. That was the answer, before she ever gave me the real one. She told me it had started small. She told me she didn't know how to stop it once it started, that it had filled something she didn't know was empty until it was full. She told me she loved me the entire time, in a tone that suggested she believed that sentence carried some kind of mercy in it. It didn't. It just made the 11 months feel longer. I asked her one question. I'd promised myself I would only ask one, because I already had the facts, I only needed the thing the facts couldn't tell me. I asked her why Paul. Not why the affair. Why him, specifically, out of everyone she could have chosen to fill whatever it was she said was empty. She said he made her feel like she existed outside of being someone's wife and someone's mother. I sat with that sentence for a long time after she said it, long after the conversation had moved on to logistics and lawyers and how we'd tell the kids. It wasn't an excuse. But it wasn't nothing either. It was the most honest thing she said to me in the entire conversation, and it told me something about the marriage I'd been too comfortable to ask myself. I understood then that you can share a bed with someone for 11 years and still be entirely alone in the marriage, and neither of you has to be the villain for that to be true. I'm not saying it to excuse her. I'm saying it because it's the truest thing I took from that year, and I spent a long time resisting it because resisting it was easier than sitting inside it. We separated in March. The divorce was finalized the following January, slower than either of us wanted, faster than either of us was ready for. I got the house. She moved into an apartment 15 minutes away so the kids wouldn't have to change schools. Paul Whitfield, as far as I ever learned, lasted 4 months past the divorce filing before Renee ended it herself. I never asked why. I told myself I didn't care, and for the most part, by then, I didn't. The kids took it the way kids take these things. Sophie blamed herself for the candle comment for longer than she should have, until I sat her down and told her, as plainly as I could, that nothing she said had broken anything, it had only let me see what was already broken. Daniel got quiet for almost a year and then, slowly, didn't. Custody settled into an uneasy, workable rhythm. Holidays got divided with the kind of careful math that never quite feels fair to anyone. I thought I knew my wife. I knew her schedule, her coffee order, her laugh. Turns out there was a version of her I'd never met, and another version of myself I'd never had to look at, because looking at it would have meant admitting that comfort and connection aren't the same thing, and I had been living for years inside the comfort, mistaking it for the real thing. For the first 2 years after the divorce, there was almost no contact between us beyond the kids, school events, a shared calendar app, the occasional logistics text about a dentist appointment or a missed pickup. She remarried in year 3, a man named Curtis who worked in commercial real estate and seemed, from the little I saw of him at graduations and recitals, decent enough. I dated. Nothing serious took. I told myself that was fine. I want to skip ahead now, because the next 3 years were mostly ordinary, the slow, unremarkable work of rebuilding a life around 2 kids growing into teenagers, a job that promoted me into a supervisory role I hadn't expected to want, a quiet house that stopped feeling like a wound and started, eventually, to just feel like a house. I'm not going to pretend those years were dramatic. They weren't. They were the part of the story nobody tells because it's mostly just time passing and a person slowly becoming someone steadier than he was. 5 years after the divorce, on a Thursday evening in late October, I was sitting in my kitchen, a different kitchen, in a different house, the faucet in this one fixed the day I moved in, when my phone buzzed with a text from Renee. I made a mistake. 3 words. No punctuation beyond the period she didn't even bother to include. No context. My first instinct, trained by over a decade of reading incomplete statements for a living, was to wait. People who are about to explain themselves don't usually open with the conclusion. They build to it. This wasn't a build. This was an ending dropped without a beginning. I typed back, "What happened?" It took her 4 minutes to respond, which told me something. 4 minutes is a long time to compose 3 words back, and a short time to have thought through what she actually wanted to say. Her reply was, "I'm not sure how to explain it. I just need you to know I'm sorry. For everything. For everything. Not for something specific. Not for a particular Tuesday or a particular lie or a particular missed Christmas Eve. For everything, the way you apologize when the apology is bigger than any single act and you don't know how to make it smaller." I sat with the phone in my hand longer than I want to admit. 5 years had given me distance from the marriage, but distance isn't the same as immunity, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt something tighten in my chest that I recognized as the ghost of who I'd been at that kitchen table with the photographs spread out in front of me. And then I looked at the message header again, the way I'd look at a claim file before deciding whether to trust the first read of it. It was a group thread. I scrolled up, past the message, to see who else was on it. 3 other names. People I didn't immediately recognize, not Paul Whitfield, not anyone from the school, not anyone from her current life that I knew of. Names with no faces attached, no context, nothing I could place. The message hadn't been written to me. It had been written to a list, and I was simply one name among several who'd received the exact same 3 words, the exact same apology, with no specificity for any of us at all. That was the moment. I didn't recognize it as the real one yet. I thought the real moment had already happened, years ago, at a different kitchen table. I was wrong about that. This was its own moment, and it was about to tell me something I hadn't understood the first time around. I want to slow down here, because everything that follows depends on what I did next, and what I did next surprised even me. I didn't respond right away. I sat with the names. I recognized one, barely, a half memory from somewhere I couldn't place, a name that triggered something in the part of my brain trained to flag inconsistencies for a living. Marcy Holloway. I knew that name from somewhere outside my marriage entirely. It took me almost 20 minutes, sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold, to place it. Marcy Holloway had been Renee's college roommate. Not a name from our marriage. A name from before it, a name I'd heard exactly twice in 11 years, both times in passing, both times in a tone that suggested ancient history with no weight left in it. The second name, Don Ferris, took longer. I eventually placed him as a colleague from Renee's first teaching job, before we'd even met, a name that had surfaced once during a story about a difficult department head years into our marriage, told as a funny anecdote with no particular charge to it. The third name I never placed at all. J. Whitcomb. No context I could locate. What struck me, sitting there, wasn't who they were. It was when they were from. Every name on that thread, including mine, belonged to a different era of Renee's life. Not a single one of them overlapped with another. I was the only name from the marriage itself. The others were scattered across decades, college, an early job, something I couldn't place at all. I had spent 5 years assuming, without ever fully articulating it to myself, that if Renee ever circled back to apologize, it would be about me. About us. About the specific, particular damage she'd done to one specific, particular life. That assumption had quietly shaped how I read her text the moment it arrived, as something aimed at me, however imperfectly worded. It wasn't aimed at me. It was aimed at a category of person she'd apparently decided, all at once, on one Thursday evening, that she owed something to. I was not a singular wound she was trying to address. I was an item on a list. I texted Daniel, who was 23 by then and had stayed close enough to his mother to know things I didn't. I didn't ask him to spy, I want to be clear about that, because by then I'd learned the difference between gathering facts and weaponizing my own children, and I was not going to make that mistake twice in one lifetime. I just asked, plainly, if everything was okay with his mom. He said she'd had some kind of health scare 2 weeks earlier. Nothing fatal, he said, a cardiac episode that turned out to be manageable, not catastrophic, but frightening enough in the moment that she'd spent a night in the hospital thinking it might be more serious than it was. He said she'd been weird since then. Reflective. He said she'd mentioned wanting to clear some things up with people from her past. I called it weird closure seeking then. I wouldn't call it that anymore, not once I understood the rest of it. I want to tell you what I did next, because it's the part of this story that surprised me most about myself. I didn't respond to the group thread. I didn't ask her, directly, what she meant by everything, or why I'd been folded into a list with 2 people whose names I could barely place and one I couldn't place at all. Instead, I sat with a question I hadn't expected to still have the energy to ask, 5 years out, what did she think she owed me, specifically, that could be folded into the same 3 words she was sending to a college roommate and a forgotten work colleague. I called Renee directly 2 days later. Not a text. A call, the kind we hadn't had in years that wasn't strictly about the kids' schedules. She sounded different on the phone than I expected, smaller, somehow, in a way that had nothing to do with the cardiac scare and everything to do with whatever had been sitting in her for longer than 2 weeks. She told me the hospital stay had scared her in a way nothing else had in years. She said she'd spent the night in a room by herself, hooked up to monitors, thinking about every relationship she'd ever damaged and never properly closed. I asked her what she meant by closing them. She said she'd made a list, an actual list, written by hand, in a notebook by her hospital bed, of people she felt she'd wronged across her whole life, and that she'd decided, lying there, that she didn't want to die without at least acknowledging it to each of them. I asked why she'd sent it as one message to all of us at once instead of individually. She paused long enough that I understood the answer before she gave it. She said it felt like too much, doing it one at a time, too many separate conversations, too much separate guilt to sit inside, one after another. It was easier, she said, to send it once and let it cover everyone. I sat with that for a long moment before I said anything back. I had spent 5 years assuming that if this apology ever came, it would cost her something specific, that it would require her to sit inside the particular shape of what she'd done to me, to our marriage, to the year I spent driving kids to practice while she sat in a motel room 20 minutes from the school. Instead, she had found a way to apologize that cost her almost nothing at all. One message. 3 words. No particulars. Sent to 4 people whose damages had nothing to do with each other, bundled together so she wouldn't have to feel the specific weight of any single one of them. I understood, sitting there with the phone against my ear, what the real twist of this whole story actually was. It wasn't that she'd cheated. I'd known that for 5 years. I'd built my entire post-divorce life around already knowing that. The twist was this: even now, with nothing left to lose and a hospital bed behind her, she still couldn't bring herself to address what she'd done to me as its own thing. She'd flattened 11 years of marriage and 11 months of an affair into the same 3 words she'd send a college roommate she hadn't spoken to in 2 decades. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I appreciated the call, and that I hoped she felt better. I didn't tell her what I'd just understood. I didn't think she was in a place to hear it, and honestly, I wasn't sure I needed her to hear it. I think I just needed to know it myself. I sat in my kitchen long after the call ended, the coffee finally gone cold for the second time that week, and I thought about the 11 years before the affair, the 11 months during it, and the 5 years since the divorce that I'd spent quietly assuming I understood the whole shape of what had happened between us. I didn't, not fully, until that text. The affair had told me what she'd done. The group thread told me something about why she'd been able to do it at all, and why she still, even at her most vulnerable, reached for the version of honesty that cost the least. A real apology has a shape. It names the specific harm, to the specific person, without folding it into anyone else's. What I got wasn't that. What I got was an apology addressed to no one in particular, which is the same thing as an apology addressed to herself. I think that's the real reason it took her 11 months to come home from a motel and own it to my face, and 5 years to even gesture at owning it from a hospital bed, not because the guilt wasn't real, but because real guilt, fully named, requires you to sit inside someone else's pain instead of your own. Renee had always been better at feeling bad than at being specific about why. I spent a year after the divorce looking for the moment it broke. I finally understood there wasn't one. It had been a slow leak, the kind that rots the floor before you ever smell the water. The house looked fine from the outside. That's the part that took longest to forgive myself for, not that she'd lied, but that I'd let the floor rot for that long without once getting down on my knees to check it. The most painful detail in this story isn't the motel, the perfume, or even the 11 months Marcus spent slowly assembling proof of something he already knew. It's the 3-word text that arrives 5 years later, addressed to a group instead of a person, because it reveals that even Renee's reckoning with what she did was, in its own way, an extension of the same pattern that let the affair happen in the first place, a preference for the version of honesty that costs the least. There's a temptation to read Renee as simply someone who got caught and, years later, tried to make amends. The story resists that reading. Her affair with Paul Whitfield didn't begin with a grand betrayal, it began with a feeling of being unseen inside a marriage that had quietly become comfortable instead of connected, and it grew slowly enough that by the time it had a name, it had already become a habit. That doesn't excuse it. But it explains something Marcus himself comes to understand, that you can be loved and still be lonely inside the same relationship, and that loneliness doesn't announce itself, it accumulates, the way Marcus's own avoidance accumulated, one unasked question at a time. What's striking is how closely Marcus's flaw mirrors Renee's, even though their actions look nothing alike on the surface. He fixed the faucet instead of asking about the phone. He built a case instead of asking a question. He gathered proof for months because proof felt safer than confrontation, because some part of him understood that once he said the words out loud, the marriage would have to change, and he wasn't ready to be the one who changed it. Renee, in her own way, did something structurally similar 5 years later. She wrote a list instead of writing letters, sent one message instead of 4, because specificity would have required her to sit inside Marcus's particular pain instead of a general, diffuse guilt she could share equally among strangers from her past. Both of them, in their own moments of reckoning, reached for the version of honesty that asked the least of them. This is where the story's real subject comes into focus. It isn't really about infidelity. It's about 2 people who each, in their own register, preferred the manageable version of the truth over the specific one, Marcus by gathering evidence instead of asking a direct question for nearly a year, Renee by bundling a decade-spanning apology into 3 words that cost her nothing in particular. Neither of them lied, exactly. They simply chose the version of honesty that didn't require them to feel the full weight of what they were naming. There's also something worth sitting with in how the story treats forgiveness, or rather, how it refuses to offer it cleanly. Marcus doesn't forgive Renee in any conventional sense by the story's end. He doesn't need to. What he arrives at instead is something more precise, an understanding of why her apology felt hollow, which turns out to matter more to him than whether he forgives her at all. He doesn't need her remorse to be perfect. He needs it to be specific to him, and when it isn't, he finally understands that it never really was, even at the start, even during the marriage itself. The affair wasn't really about Paul. It was about Renee's lifelong habit of needing to be seen without doing the work of being known, and that habit didn't end with the divorce. It followed her into a hospital bed 5 years later, dressed up as closure. If this story reached you, it's probably because some part of it felt uncomfortably familiar, not necessarily the affair, but the long, quiet stretch beforehand where something was already wrong and nobody said so out loud. The question this story leaves you with isn't whether you've been betrayed, or whether you've betrayed someone else. It's simpler and harder than that. When you've had to apologize for something real, did you name what you actually did, or did you, like Renee, reach for the version that let you feel sorry without ever having to be specific about why?